Pink Floyd were pioneers in the live music experience, renowned for their lavish stage shows that combine intense visual experiences with music to create a show in which the performers themselves are almost secondary. Pink Floyd's combination of music and visuals set the standard for rock musicians. As well as visuals, Pink Floyd set standards in sound quality with innovative use of sound effects and panning quadrophonic speaker systems. Special effects, besides the music, arguably the most important and certainly the most elaborate part to any Pink Floyd live show is the special effects. Yes, we did all sorts of strange things, for live concerts as well. We used to make up tapes for the audience to come in by. We had 1.5 hour long tape, which we'd play for the half an hour the audience was coming in just before we started our show, and things like that. Just tapes of bird noises in quadrophonic sound, with birds singing, and pheasants taking off in the distance, and swans taking off from water, a tractor driving down one side of the room, and an airplane going over the top, and all these things carrying on, all just from different sound effects records. You just stick them in and you create a type of mood. The light show, Pink Floyd were among the first bands to use a dedicated traveling light show in conjunction with their performances. During the Barrett era, dynamic liquid light shows were projected onto enormous screens behind the band while they played, and the band also incorporated large numbers of strobe lights, which were controlled manually by an engineer. This had the effect of totally obscuring the band itself, except for their shadows, which Barrett took advantage of. He would hold his arms up during parts where he was not required to play, making his shadow grow, shrink and undulate, adding to the visual spectacle. They developed many of these lighting techniques through their fortuitous early association with light artist Mike Leonard. When psychedelia fell out of fashion from about 1970 onwards, elevated platforms of the type conventionally used for roof maintenance in high buildings were brought on tour and filled with lighting equipment to be raised and lowered during performances. Following Roger Waters' departure in 1984, the Pink Floyd light show reached a dazzling pinnacle. Mark Brickman, the group's lighting designer, utilized hundreds of automated intelligent lighting fixtures and lasers, which were state-of-the-art at the time. By the 1994 Division Bell tour, the band was using extremely powerful, isotope-splitting copper vapor lasers. These gold-colored lasers were worth over $120,000 apiece and previously had only been used in nuclear research and high-speed photography. A large circular projection panel dubbed Mr. Screen first made an appearance during performances of Dark Side of the Moon in 1974 and became a staple thereafter. Specially recorded films and animations were projected onto it, and for 1977 In the Flesh, and 1980–1981 The Wall live tours, colored spotlights were fixed around the rim, an effect which reached its zenith with the dancing patterns of multicolored lights in the A Momentary Lapse of Reason and Division Bell tours. In the latter, the screen could be retracted behind the stage when not required, and was tilted horizontally with its peripheral lights focused onto the stage into a single spotlight during the final guitar solo in Comfortably Numb. Several generations of giant glitter balls began with the Dark Side of the Moon tour. By the Division Bell tour, the ball had evolved into a globe 4.9 meters in diameter, which rose from the mixing station to a height of 21.3 meters before opening into an array of petals 7.3 meters wide during the final guitar solo of Comfortably Numb, revealing a 12-kilowatt Phobius HMI lamp inside. Props and pyrotechnics. Thanks to stage architect-designer Mark Fisher, Pink Floyd's tours became a staple in the industry because of their outstanding special and scenic effects. Pyrotechnics and dry ice were used extensively throughout Pink Floyd's career. In 1973's tour to promote The Dark Side of the Moon, a large-scale model plane flew over the audience and crashed onto the stage with a spectacular explosion, an effect repeated at the start of The Wall and the Division Bell shows. During shows to promote A Momentary Lapse of Reason, a similar effect was achieved with a flying bed. Oversized helium balloons were first introduced during the Dark Side of the Moon tours, but in 1975, this element began to play a central part of the live show. For the U.S. leg of the 1975 tour, a pyramid-shaped dirigible was floated above the stage. It proved unstable in windy conditions and blew into the crowd, which tore it into pieces for souvenirs. The trademark giant pig was brought in for animals in 1977, floating over the audience, as well as a grotesque nuclear family, a refrigerator filled with snakes, a television and a Cadillac. In some shows, an envelope of propane gas was put inside of the pig, causing it to explode. The inflatables reached their peak in 1980–1981 during the wall shows, in which several of the characters from the album were brought to life in the form of fully mobile, giant string puppets with menacing spotlights for eyes, taking the traditional balloons to a new level. The characters were designed by the notable satirical artist, Gerald Scarfe. Special effects reached a new and outrageous level during these wall shows. For example, a 160-foot-long, 35-foot-high wall made from 340 white bricks was built between the audience and the band during the first half of the show. The final brick was placed as Roger Waters sang goodbye at the end of the song Goodbye Cruel World. For the second half of the show, the band was largely invisible, except for a hole in the wall that simulated a hotel room where Roger Waters acted out the story of Pink, and an appearance by David Gilmour on top of the wall to perform the climactic guitar solo in Comfortably Numb. Other parts of the story were told by Gerald Scarfe animations projected onto the wall itself. At the finale of the concert, the wall was demolished amid sound effects and a spectacular light show. Major tours and concerts: September 30, 1966, the All Saints Church Hall Concert, International Times Benefit Show, April 29, the Euro 30, 1967, the 14-hour Technicolor Dream Concerts, May 12, 1967, Games for May Concert, November 4, the Euro 12, 1967, First U.S. Tour, June 29, 1968, Midsummer High Weekend Concert, February, December 1968, Pink Floyd World Tour 1968 May, September 1969, The Man and the Journey Tour, June 27, 1970, Bath Festival Concert, September 1970. October 1971, Atom Heart Mother World Tour, October, November 1971, Medal Tour, January 1972, November 1973, Dark Side of the Moon Tour, June 1974, French Summer Tour, November, December 1974, British Winter Tour, April, July 1975, Wish You Were Here Tour, January, July 1977, In the Flesh Tour promoting Animals, February 1980, June 1981, The Wall 1980 A Euro 1981, September 1987, August 1988, A Momentary Lapse of Reason Tour, May 1989. July 1989, Another Lapse Tour, June 30, 1990, Nebworth Festival Concert, March, October 1994, The Division Bell Tour, July 2005, Live 8 Concert, May 10, 2007, Syd Barrett Tribute Concert. Comprehensive details of all of Pink Floyd's live appearances can be found at the Pink Floyd Archives. Performance history highlights: Barrett era. The earliest shows for what is considered to be Pink Floyd occurred in 1965 and included Bob Close as a member of the band, which at the time played mainly R&B covers. Close left the band after 1965. The remaining four members played very small, mostly unadvertised shows at the Marquee Club in London through June 1966. The setlist continued to include R&B, but some original psychedelia was also being introduced. On September 30, 1966, Pink Floyd were invited to play All Saints Church Hall to raise money for the Nascent International Times newspaper, and quickly became the house band. At these shows, the band began its use of visual effects and gradually stopped covering R&B. Word of these shows quickly spread in the London underground culture and soon the band became very well attended and developed a cult following. On December 23, 1966, the first of the International Times associated gigs to be held at the legendary UFO Club was performed. Mainstream interest about the counter-culture was increasing and a very small portion of their January 20, 1967 show at the UFO Club was broadcast as part of Granada TV's documentary entitled It's So Far Out, It's Straight Down, which constitutes the first audio or visual record of the band live. Pink Floyd were among the 30 bands that played the 14-hour Technicolor Dream benefit gig organized for the International Times Legal Defense Fund and held at the Alexandra Palace in London on the eve of April 30, 1967. Some of the other bands who played were The Who, The Move, The Pretty Things, Soft Machine, Tomorrow and The Creation. Notables in attendance included musician John Lennon, artist John Dunbar, actor Michael Caine, artist and musician Yoko Ono, actress Julie Christie, musician Mick Jagger and artist David Hockney. Although both the BBC and filmmaker Peter Whitehead filmed portions of the event, there is no known footage of Pink Floyd. On May 12, 1967, Pink Floyd performed at Queen Elizabeth Hall in London a concert entitled Games for May. At this show, they debuted a multi-speaker pan-pot system controlled by joystick from the stage that allowed them to move sound to anywhere a speaker had been set up. This precursor to their later Azimuth coordinator unfortunately was stolen after the show. After their debut single, Arnold Lane, charted well in the UK, the band was invited to perform on the BBC Two music show The Look of the Week on May 14, 1967. The setlist for the broadcast consisted of Power Talk H and Astronomy Domin. This was their first British television appearance. Pink Floyd were invited to appear on the BBC Two music show Top of the Pops in July 1967 for 3 weeks after their second single See Emily Play reached number 6 on the UK charts. By this time Syd Barrett's behaviour had become somewhat unpredictable. On one occasion, the increasingly difficult Barrett remarked that if John Lennon didn't have to appear on Top of the Pops neither did he. Consequently, their management company, Black Hill Enterprises, convinced the band to cancel all of their August shows and go to Spain to recuperate. Increasingly, throughout the summer and into the fall of 1967, copious drug use and pressure by the record company to constantly write new hit songs continued to take a toll on Barrett's mental state. He became unable to make a meaningful contribution to the group on stage, playing his guitar incoherently and sometimes not playing at all. By the time of the band's first tour of the US in early November 1967, his condition was plainly showing. He stared blankly into space on their November 4 American Bandstand performance, listlessly strummed and barely managed to mime the vocals to Apples and Oranges. On November 5, things got worse. They appeared on The Pat Boone Show and Sid sat in stubborn silence, refusing to answer any question put to him. He also refused to mime to See Emily Play. Waters was forced to mime the track instead. After the 22nd December show, the rest of band quietly put out word that they were in need of a guitarist. Although both Jeff Beck and Dave Earlist were considered, it was David Gilmour, then unobligated, who was brought on to augment Sid as need arose during live shows. For the first 4 shows of 1968, Pink Floyd was a 5-man live act again. When they were on the way to their show at Southampton University on January 26, 1968, they decided not to pick up Sid. Transition and Experimentation, c. Pink Floyd European Tour 1968. A typical 1968 setlist would include some of the following: Astronomy Domin, Interstellar Overdrive, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, Power Talk H. Let There Be More Light, The Masked Gadgets of Hercules, Flaming, Keep Smiling People. Although their management company Black Hill Enterprises parted ways with them over their decision about Syd Barrett on June 29, 1968, Pink Floyd headlined the first free Hyde Park concert organized by Black Hill. Others performing were Tyrannosaurus Rex, Roy Harper and Jethro Tull. The one in '68 was wonderful because it was much more a picnic in the park than a mini Woodstock. A Lovely Day. It was important for us too because it reminded us of our roots, whether spurious or not. They were our roots, not personally, but as an enterprise. We were the house band. A second tour of the US during July and August 1968 was launched to tie into the release of their second album, A Saucerful of Secrets. Increasingly throughout 1968 and 1969, shows consisted of post-Barrett compositions, with notable exceptions being Astronomy Domin, and Interstellar Overdrive, both of which were performed into the 1970s. Their audiences changed during this time as well. While Barrett-era crowds consisted mainly of hippies who would dance in time with the music, they now drew more intellectual crowd, who would sit and remain quiet until the last note of a song was played. By early 1969, most of their excess earnings were funneled into upgrading their sound equipment rather than maintaining a permanent light show. If visuals were to be used at all, they had to be provided by the venue or the local promoter. A typical 1969 setlist would include some of the following: See the Man and the Journey Tour, The Man the Journey, Astronomy Domin, Interstellar Overdrive, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, Power Talk H. Let There Be More Light, A Saucer Full of Secrets, Cymbeline, Green as the Color, Main Theme, Careful with That Axe, Eugene, The Shows at Mother's, Birmingham on April 27, 1969 and the College of Commerce, Manchester on May 2, 1969 were recorded for the live part of the Ummagumma album. One source also claims that the show at Bromley Technical College on April 26, 1969 was also recorded for the album. On April 14, 1969, at Royal Festival Hall, they debuted their new Pan-Pot 360-degree sound system dubbed the Azimuth Coordinator. This show, named More Furious Madness from the Massed Gadgets of Oi Means, consisted of two experimental suites, The Man, and The Journey. Most of the songs were either renamed earlier material or under a different name than they would eventually be released. A UK tour occurred during May and June 1969, culminating in the show dubbed The Final Lunacy at Royal Albert Hall on June 26, 1969. Considered one of the most experimental concerts by Pink Floyd, it featured a crew member dressed as a gorilla, a cannon that fired, and band members soaring wood on the stage. At the finale of the Journey suite, the band was joined on stage by the brass section of the Royal Philharmonic and the ladies of the Ealing Central Amateur Choir, and at the very end a huge pink smoke bomb was let off. An additional complete performance of The Man the Journey occurred at the Concertgebouw, Amsterdam on September 17 and was taped and later broadcast by Dutch radio station Hilversum 3. Portions of the suites were being performed as late as early 1970. The Atom Heart Mother era, a typical 1970 setlist would include some of the following: Astronomy Domin, Interstellar Overdrive, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, A Saucer Full of Secrets, Cymbeline, Green as the Color, Main Theme, Careful with That Axe, Eugene, Sisyphus PTS. 1-4, Grantchester Meadows, Embryo, The Violent Sequence, Atom Heart Mother, Fat Old Son, Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast. Early in 1970, Pink Floyd performed at gigs a piece from their film soundtrack for Michelangelo Antonioni's film Zabriskie Point, referred to as The Violent Sequence. This was the musical basis for Us and Them, from their Dark Side of the Moon album. Lacking only the lyrics, it is identical to the final song and is the earliest part of the seminal album to have been performed live. The song Embryo was also a part of the live repertoire around this time, but was never to appear on a studio album, until the compilation album Works. On January 18, 1970, the band began performing an untitled instrumental piece, which would eventually become the title track to their next album Atom Heart Mother. At this point, it had no orchestra or choir accompaniment. The song officially debuted at the Bath Festival, Somerset, England on June 27, 1970 under the title The Amazing Pudding, and for the first time with orchestra and choir accompaniment. Announced as the Atom Heart Mother by legendary British broadcaster John Peel on his BBC Radio 1 show Peel's Sunday Concert on July 16, 1970, a name suggested by him to the band, it was also announced as the Atomic Heart Mother 2 days later at the Hyde Park Free Concert. Partly because of the difficulties of finding and hiring local orchestras and choirs, the band often played what is referred to as the small band version of the song when they performed it live. Pink Floyd also appeared at a free festival in Canterbury on August 31, which was filmed. This was the end leg of the Medicine Ball Caravan tour organised by Warner Brothers, which was later made into a film of the same name. It appears that the Pink Floyd footage was not included in the movie, but spectators report that Atom Heart Mother was part of the set that was recorded. The audience must have been one of the smallest to see Pink Floyd at this era, only 1,500 were present as the festival was not widely promoted. In contrast, Over 500,000 people witnessed their show at Fête de l'Humanité Copyright, Paris on September 12, 1970, their largest crowd ever. Filmed by French TV, the show was never broadcast. Experimental on the album Atom Heart Mother, the song Alan Psychedelic Breakfast was performed at a few gigs in December 1970. Breakfast Being Made was part of the song. The first part of this lasted around 4 minutes. The second part of Breakfast Preparation was around a minute, followed by a 3-minute tape of British DJ Jimmy Young, whom the band disliked. For a great recording of some of their material from this period, check out the Fillmore West show in San Francisco, California on April 29, 1970 on Wolfgang's Vault. This show includes material from Ummagumma and Atom Heart Mother. This was a short tour since their equipment got stolen a few weeks after this show and they cancelled the rest of their tour. Early performances of Echoes, a typical 1971 set list would include some of the following: Astronomy Domin, Interstellar Overdrive, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, A Saucer Full of Secrets, Cymbeline, Green as the Color, Careful with That Axe, Eugene, Embryo, Atom Heart Mother, Fat Old Son, Echoes, One of These Days. January 1971 saw the band working on a track in the studio of then unconnected parts whose working title was either Nothing Euro Parts 1 to 24, or Nothing Parts 1 Euro 36. This song made its live debut under the working title Return of the Son of Nothing on April 22, 1971 at Norwich, England, and like Atom Heart Mother before it, it was a work in progress. This was later to be released as Echoes on the album Medal. Although announced as Echoes on August 6, 1971 at Hakone, Japan, the song was still performed with the additional lyrics at later August gigs. The show on September 18, 1971 at Montreux, Switzerland, and subsequent shows do not have the additional lyrics. In 1972, during a German tour, Waters sardonically introduced Echoes as Looking Through the Knotholes and Granny's Wooden Leg on one occasion and The March of the Dam Busters on another. On another occasion, during a live radio broadcast, Waters had instructed the DJ to announce One of These Days to the home audience as a poignant appraisal of the contemporary social situation. After the band's Crystal Palace Garden Party performance, it was discovered that the sheer volume of the gig caused the nearby pond's entire fauna to die. The band was subsequently pressured to compensate for the ecological damage. Eclipse, a piece for assorted lunatics. A typical 1972 set list included: First Set, Breathe in the Air, The Travel Sequence, Time, Home Again, The Mortality Sequence, Money, The Violent Sequence, Scat, Lunatic, Eclipse, Second Set, One of These Days, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, Careful with That Axe, Eugene, Echoes, Atom Heart Mother, A Saucer Full of Secrets, Childhood's End, Encore, rotated one of these three songs, A Saucer Full of Secrets, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, Echoes. Occasionally, multiple song encores were performed, adding Blues, playing 98 shows. 1972 was the last time. Pink Floyd varied their set lists each night on a tour until their final one. Songs played in the second set and encore were swapped constantly, and the band even varied the number of songs played in the encore from the usual 1 to 2 or 3. 1972 saw Pink Floyd debut the performance of a not just a song, but an entire album prior to its release. The original title was Eclipse, then The Dark Side of the Moon, a piece for assorted lunatics, the name under which it made its press debut in February 1972 at London's Rainbow Theatre. The title changed for the first part of the US tour to Eclipse during April and May before reverting to Dark Side of the Moon, a piece for assorted lunatics in September for the second part of the US tour, and finally released in 1973 under the title of Dark Side of the Moon. One of the two shows at the Dome, Brighton, England on June 28 and June 29 was filmed by Peter Clifton for inclusion on his film Sounds of the City. Clips of these appear occasionally on television, and the performance of Careful with That Axe, Eugene, is on the various artists' video Superstars in Concert. In November 1972, during the middle of the European leg of their 1972 World Tour and again in January 1973, Pink Floyd performed with a Roland Petty Ballet. The portion of the setlist for which the ballet was choreographed was One of These Days, Careful with That Axe, Eugene, Obscured by Clouds, When You're In, and Echoes. Dark Side of the Moon. An early 1973 setlist included, first set, Echoes, Obscured by Clouds / When You're In, Childhood's End, Careful with That Axe, Eugene. Second set, The Dark Side of the Moon entire album encore, One of These Days. For remainder of 1973, the setlist included, first set, Obscured by Clouds, When You're In, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, Careful with That Axe, Eugene. Echoes. Second set, The Dark Side of the Moon entire album encore, One of These Days. In 1973, the band moved Dark Side of the Moon to the second set, and played the album version of the piece, notably the revamped versions of On the Run, and The Great Gig in the Sky. 1973 saw Pink Floyd go on two relatively short tours of the U.S., one in March to coincide with the release of The Dark Side of the Moon and a later one in June. Sandwiched between them were two nights at London's Earls Court on May 18 and May 19 where they debuted the special effect of a plane crashing into the stage at the end of the song On the Run. This was also the first year that the band took additional musicians on tour with them, unlike the earlier performances of Atom Heart Mother, where the band would often hire local musicians. Because of the overwhelming chart success of both The Dark Side of the Moon, which reached number 1 in the US in late April, number 2 in the UK, and the US released single Money, the nature of Pink Floyd's audiences changed in June 1973. David Gilmour said of the change it was Money that made the difference rather than The Dark Side of the Moon. It gave us a much larger following, for which we should be thankful. People at the front shouting, "Play Money. Gimme something I can shake my ass to." We had to get used to it, but previously we'd been playing to 10,000 seaters where, in the quiet passages, you could hear a pin drop. They could now sell out stadiums. On November 4, 1973, Pink Floyd played 2 shows at London's Rainbow Theatre to benefit musician Robert Wyatt, formerly the drummer of Soft Machine, a band they'd played with in their UFO Club days. Wyatt fell from a 4th-floor window in June 1973, breaking his back and making him a paraplegic. The set list for these 2 shows were, main set, Dark Side of the Moon entire album encore, Obscured by Clouds, When You're In, 1974 tours. A French summer tour set list would include all of the following, Raving and Drooling, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, Echoes, Dark Side of the Moon, Encore, Careful with That Axe, Eugene, One of These Days. A British summer tour set list included all of the following, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, Raving and Drooling, You've Got to Be Crazy, Dark Side of the Moon, Encore, Echoes. These early versions of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, Raving and Drooling, and You've Got to Be Crazy were released as part of the Wish You Were Here experience and immersion sets. 1975 North America Tour and Nebworth 75. A typical 1975 set would include all of the following, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, Have a Cigar, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, Raving and Drooling, You've Got to Be Crazy, Dark Side of the Moon, Encore, Echoes. In 1975, the band launched a short tour that ended 2 months prior to the release of Wish You Were Here, which eventually sold out stadiums and arenas across America. The last gig of the tour was as the headliner of 1975 Nebworth Festival, which also featured the Steve Miller Band, Captain Beefheart and Roy Harper. It was the second Nebworth Festival, which featured artists such as the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Genesis and Frank Zappa between 1974 and 1979. Despite some technical problems, the band managed to perform a remarkable concert, which as well as the usual special effects featured a fly-past by a pair of Spitfires. This was supposed to synchronize with the start of Breathe, but the band had tuning difficulties and the planes flew over before the start of the set. Nebworth was the last time the band would perform Echoes, and the entire Dark Side of the Moon with Roger Waters. In the Flesh. A typical 1977 set list would include the following, Animals, Wish You Were Here, Encore, Money, Us and Them, Careful with That Axe, Eugene, More Blues. The 1977 In the Flesh tour was the last time Pink Floyd performed a major worldwide tour with Roger Waters. The tour featured the famous character inflatables puppets, and also featured a pyrotechnic waterfall, and one of the biggest and most elaborate stages to date, including umbrella-like canopies that would raise from the stage to protect the band from the elements. Pink Floyd's market strategy for the In the Flesh tour was very aggressive, filling pages of the New York Times and Billboard magazine. To promote their four-night run at Madison Square Garden in New York City, there was a Pink Floyd parade on 6th Avenue featuring pigs and sheep. The Animals tour was the first tour since their 1972 tour that Pink Floyd didn't use female backing singers. The musicians that augmented the band for the tour was sax player Dick Parry and guitarist Snowy White. In the first half of the show, Pink Floyd played all of the Animals album in a slightly different sequence to the album, starting with Sheep, then Pigs on the Wing, Dogs, Pigs on the Wing and Pigs. During Pigs, Waters would shout the number of the concert on the tour, such as 1 to 5. For the 15th show, the second half of the show consisted of the Wish You Were Here album in its exact running order: Welcome to the Machine, Have a Cigar, Wish You Were Here, and Shine On You Crazy Diamond. The encores would usually consist of either Money, or Us and Them from Dark Side of the Moon, or both. At the Oakland, California show on May 9 they played Careful with That Axe, Eugene as a third encore. It was the last time it was ever performed live. The final night of the tour on July 6 at Montreal's Olympic Stadium had a third encore of More Blues, which saw David Gilmour sit out the final encore as he was unhappy with the band's performance that night. Snowy White played a bluesy guitar solo with the rest of Pink Floyd in Gilmour's place. During the tour, Waters began to exhibit increasingly aggressive behavior, and would often yell abusively at disruptive audiences who wouldn't stop yelling and screaming during the quieter numbers. In the New York shows they had to use local workers as lighting technicians because of union problems with their own crew. They had several difficulties with the workers. For example, Waters once had to beckon one of the spotlights to move higher when it only illuminated his lower legs and feet while he was singing. The Montreal show, July 6, 1977, the final performance of the tour, ended with Pink Floyd performing a blues jam as the roadies dismantled the instruments in front of the insatiable audience, who refused to let the band leave the stadium. A small riot at the front of the stage followed the band's eventual exit. That night, Waters spat in the face of a disruptive fan. The war grew out of Waters' thoughts about this incident, particularly his growing awareness that stardom had alienated him from his audience. There were few shows on the tour that went smoothly. One example was at their Boston performance at Boston Garden on June 27, 1977, when Waters jokingly said, "We're going to take a PIG break, back in 20 minutes. Then said the final good night in a jovial manner, the perfect end to the perfect day, good night and God bless. Another good performance came on May 9, 1977, in Oakland, California. Throughout the show, the band played flawlessly while the audience remained attentive to the music. During Have a Cigar, Waters and Gilmour can be heard laughing as they sing part of the opening line. This was also the last time the band played Careful with That Axe, Eugene live. Although the Animals album had not been as commercially successful as the previous two, the band managed to sell out arenas and stadiums in America and Europe, setting scale and attendance records. In Chicago, the band played to an estimated audience of 95,000. In Cleveland and Montreal, they set attendance records for those venues by playing to over 80,000 people. The War Live. The 1980-1981 set lists comprised the entire album, The War. Pink Floyd mounted its most elaborate stage show in conjunction with the tour of The War. A band of session musicians played the first song, wearing rubber face masks taken from the real band members, then backed up the band for the remainder of the show. Most notable was the giant wall constructed between band and audience. The costs of the tour were estimated to have reached $1.5 million even before the first performance. The New York Times stated in its March 2, 1980 edition that the Wall show remains a milestone in rock history though, and there's no point in denying it. Never again will one be able to accept the technical clumsiness, distorted sound and meager visuals of most arena rock concerts as inevitable, and concluded that the Wall show will be the touchstone against which all future rock spectacles must be measured. The show was designed by Mark Fisher with art direction by Gerald Scarfe. The Wall concert was only performed a handful of times each in 4 cities: Los Angeles, Uniondale, Dortmund, and London. The primary tour occurred in 1980, but the band performed 8 shows at Dortmund and 5 more shows at Earl's Court for filming, with the intention of integrating the shows into the upcoming movie. The resulting footage was deemed substandard and scrapped. Years later, Roger Waters has given conflicted answers on the status of the concert films, stating from trying to locate this footage for historical purposes but was unsuccessful and considers it to be lost forever. I have all of the film but am reluctant to release. There are several unofficial videos of the entire live show in circulation and some footage is shown on the Behind the Wall documentary. Gilmour and Mason attempted to convince Waters to expand the show for a more lucrative, large-scale stadium tour, but because of the nature of the material Waters balked at this. In fact, Waters had reportedly been offered a guaranteed $1 million for each additional stadium concert, but declined the offer, insisting that such a tour would be hypocritical. These shows are documented on the album Is There Anybody Out There? The Wall Live 1980-81. Waters recreated the Wall show in Berlin in 1990, alongside the ruins of the Berlin Wall, and was joined by a number of guest artists. This concert was even bigger than the previous ones, as Waters built a 550-foot-long and 82-foot-high wall. The size of the theatrical features of the Wall were increased to cater for a sold-out audience of 200,000 people and of another estimated 500 million, in 35 countries, watching on television. After the concert began, the gates were opened and an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 people were able to watch the concert. This show is available on the Wall Live in Berlin album and DVD. Roger staged another tour of the Wall in 2010, saying of the story, "It has occurred to me that maybe the story of my fear and loss with its concomitant inevitable residue of ridicule, shame and punishment, provides an allegory for broader concerns: nationalism, racism, sexism, religion, whatever. All these issues and Euroisms are driven by the same fears that drove my young life." A Momentary Lapse of Reason. After the release of A Momentary Lapse of Reason in 1987, Pink Floyd embarked on an 11-week tour to promote the album. The 2 remaining members of the band, David Gilmour and Nick Mason, along with Richard Wright, had just won a legal battle against Roger Waters and the future of the group was uncertain. Having the success of the Wall shows to live up to, the concert's special effects were more impressive than ever. The initial promotional tour was extended, and finally lasted almost 2 years, ending in 1989 after playing around 200 concerts to about 5.5 million people in total, including 3 dates at Madison Square Garden and 2 nights at Wembley Stadium. The tour took Pink Floyd to various exotic locations they had never played before, such as shows in the forecourt of the Palace of Versailles, Moscow's Olympic Stadium, and Venice, despite fears and protests that the sound would damage the latter city's foundations. These shows are documented by the Delicate Sound of Thunder album and video. Pink Floyd was the second highest grossing act of 1987 and the highest grossing of 1988 in the U.S. financially. Pink Floyd was the biggest act of these 2 years combined, grossing almost $60 million from touring, about the same as U2 and Michael Jackson, their closest rivals, combined. Worldwide, the band grossed around $135 million. The tour marked the first time that the band played in Russia, Norway, Spain, New Zealand and was the first time that had played in Australia since 1973. A further concert was held at the Knebworth Festival in 1990, a charity event that also featured other Silver Clef Award winners. Pink Floyd was the last act to play, to an audience of 125,000. During this gig Claire Torre sang backing vocals, making it the second and last time she did so. Vicky and Sam Brown also attended as backing vocalists, as well as Candy Dulfer with saxophone solo. The £60,000 firework display that ended the concert was entirely financed by the band. The Division Bell. The Division Bell Tour in 1994 was promoted by Canadian concert impresario Michael Cohl and became the highest-grossing tour in rock music history to that date, with the band playing the entirety of The Dark Side of the Moon in some shows, for the first time since 1975. The concerts featured even more impressive special effects than the previous tour, including 2 custom-designed airships. The arch-shaped stage was designed by Mark Fisher with lighting by Mark Brickman. 3 stages leapfrogged around North America and Europe, each 180 feet long and featuring a 130-foot arch modeled on the Hollywood Bowl. All in all, the tour required 700 tons of steel carried by 53 articulated trucks, a crew of 161 people and an initial investment of $4 million plus $25 million of running costs just to stage. This tour played to 5.5 million people in 68 cities. Each concert gathered an average 45,000 audience. At the end of the year, the Division Bell Tour was announced as the biggest tour ever, with worldwide gross of over £150 million. In the US alone, it grossed $103.5 million from 59 concerts. However, this record was short-lived. Less than a year later, the Rolling Stones' Voodoo Lounge tour finished with a worldwide gross of over $300 million. The Stones and U2 remain the only acts ever to achieve a higher worldwide gross from a tour, even when adjusting for inflation. These shows are documented by the Pulse album and DVD. Post-Pulse era, 1996. In 1996, Gilmour and Wright performed Wish You Were Here with Billy Corgan at their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. 2001, in an interview with BBC Radio 2 in October 2001, Gilmour implied that the Echoes, the Best of Pink Floyd compilation probably signaled the end of the band. "You never know exactly what the future," Gilmour said. "I'm not going to slam any doors too firmly, but I don't see myself doing any more of that, and I certainly don't see myself going out on a big Floyd tour again." A few days later in an interview with Launch.com, Nick Mason contradicted the statement, saying, "I don't feel I've retired yet. You know, if everyone wanted to, we could certainly still do something. I've spent 30 years waiting for the planets to align. I'm quite used to it." 2002, David Gilmour released a solo concert DVD called David Gilmour in Concert in November 2002, which was compiled from shows on 22 June 2001 and 17 January 2002 at the Royal Festival Hall in London. Richard Wright, Robert Wyatt, and Bob Geldof make guest appearances. 2003, longtime manager Steve Earle died on October 30, 2003. Gilmour, Mason and Wright performed Fat Old Son, and The Great Gig in the Sky at his funeral at Chichester Cathedral, contrary to reports in the media claiming they played Wish You Were Here. 2005, Live 8, on July 2, 2005 Pink Floyd performed at the London Live 8 concert with Roger Waters rejoining David Gilmour, Nick Mason and Richard Wright. It was the quartet's first performance together in over 24 years. The band's last show with Waters was at Earl's Court in London on June 17, 1981. Gilmour announced the Live 8 reunion on June 12, 2005. The band's set consisted of Speak to Me, Breathe, Money, Wish You Were Here, and Comfortably Numb. As on the original recordings, Gilmour sang the lead vocals on Breathe and Money, and shared them with Waters on Comfortably Numb. For Wish You Were Here, Waters sang half of the verses' lyrics, unlike the original recording. When Waters was not singing, he was often enthusiastically mouthing the lyrics off microphone. During the guitar introduction of Wish You Were Here, Waters said, they were augmented by guitarist-bassist Tim Manick, keyboardist lap steel guitarist backup vocalist John Carin, saxophonist Dick Parry during Money, and backing singer Carol Kenyon during Comfortably Numb. During Breathe, on the screen behind them, film of the iconic pig from the Animals album was shown flying over Battersea Power Station, and during Money, a shot of the Dark Side of the Moon record being played was shown. During Comfortably Numb, the 3 giant screens showed the Pink Floyd wall, and during the final guitar solo, the words "Make Poverty History" were written on the wall. At the end, after the last song had been played, Gilmour said, "Thank you very much, good night." and started to walk off the stage. Waters called him back, however, and the band shared a group hug that became one of the most famous pictures of Live 8. As they proceeded to walk off, Nick Mason threw his drumsticks into the audience. With Wright's subsequent death, in September 2008, this was to be the final concert to feature all four bandmates playing together. 2007, Syd Barrett Tribute Concert. On May 10, 2007, the Sans Waters Pink Floyd took part in a Syd Barrett tribute concert in London performing Arnold Layne, and Roger Waters performed Flickering Flame. Backing musicians, see, Pink Floyd Live Backing musicians. Because of the increasingly complex nature of Pink Floyd's music, more and more musicians besides the band were required on stage to recreate sounds achieved in the studio. Some performances of Atom Heart Mother featured an entire orchestra and choir, reputedly a nightmare to bring on tour. Less weighty contributions from other musicians followed. In 1973, Dick Parry provided saxophone for Dark Side of the Moon and reprised this for live performances in every subsequent tour except those promoting The Wall and A Momentary Lapse of Reason, the latter in which Scott Page provided sax. For 1977's Animals promotion, Snowy White was brought in as an additional guitarist. He returned for the Wall shows along with a complete surrogate band consisting of Peter Wood, Willie Wilson and Andy Baum. Andy Roberts replaced White for the 1981 shows. For the A Momentary Lapse of Reason and Division Bell tours, John Caron provided additional synthesizers and keyboards, Guy Pratt replaced Roger Waters on bass, Tim Renick provided additional guitar and Gary Wallace additional percussion. Several backing vocalists have accompanied the band on and off from Dark Side of the Moon onwards. During their performance at Live 8, Pink Floyd used Tim Renick, John Caron, Dick Parry and Carol Kenyon. References. Notes. External links. 1. Mark Fisher's Pink Floyd Gallery.